Next up, we have a panel discussion on unmet needs in healthcare. So chairing this session today is Professor Alison Holmes, who is Professor of Infectious Diseases at Imperial College London. So I'll hand over to Alison now to chair this session.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here, and it's a real delight to be invited to chair this fantastic panel with four truly amazing panelists. But unfortunately, this afternoon, there's only going to be three because Corrine de Vries has not been able to join us. But nevertheless, we've got three truly fantastic global experts to talk to us about addressing the unmet needs in healthcare. And I'm just going to open this up in terms of describing what we're wanting to address. So it says in your program about drug-resistant infections and the global burden of these and the issues around antimicrobial resistance. But we also need to think about rare and neglected diseases, both genetic diseases and the neglected tropical diseases. And what on earth can we do to address these better? What are the models that we can think about to address these better globally? And also, what can we learn from each other about these models? And how can government, civil society, private and third sectors actually incentivize how we best address with these really, really important issues? So we're going to be discussing this now. As Sally said, I'm Alison Holmes. I'm a professor of infectious diseases at Imperial. I am also the president of the International Society of Infectious Diseases. I have a long-standing interest in antimicrobial resistance, infectious diseases, international health. My background is in clinical medicine. I work in the National Health Service as well as in academia. So that's me. I'm going to shut up now because you've got a distinguished group of panelists that need to introduce themselves. And I'm first going to ask Tiina to introduce herself to us, and then I'll go around the panel. Over to you, Tiina.
Hi, thank you so much, Alison. My name is Tiina. I work at the National Institutes of Health in the US, and I work in the Office of Rare Disease Research, which is in the Center for Translational Science, NCATS. So we focus primarily on rare diseases.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Tiina. And then over to Manos Perros. Manos.
Thank you, Alison, and thank you, Sally and Will, for the opportunity to address this audience. I really look forward to the conversation. I am Manos Perros. I'm a scientist by training. I actually studied biochemistry and then biophysics. I have worked in pharmaceutical companies for most of my career. I was CSO for antivirals at Pfizer. I was then heading up the Institute for Tropical Diseases for Novartis in Singapore. And then moved to AstraZeneca to head up their research and development for infectious diseases. In 2015, I pivoted in my career and still work on infectious diseases. I led a spin-out from AstraZeneca called Entasis Therapeutics. I'm the CEO, and I lead a company that focuses on discovering and developing and hopefully one day commercializing treatments for multi-drug resistant bacterial infections.
Great, thank you so much, Manos. And then finally, Neil Dugdale, over to you.
Thanks, Alison. Good afternoon, everybody, from a very wet United Kingdom. I'm the former Vice President and General Manager of SOBI, Swedish Orphan Biovitrum. And it's important for me to say that the views that I represent today are my own views and not the company views. I've been involved in rare disease for the last 6 years and have seen some good changes happen, but I think we're all aware that many more changes need to happen. I'm part of a rare disease group called Ardent, which I'll talk a little bit more about, hopefully, in the next 30 minutes. And I'm also a director of a not-for-profit organization called Rare Disease Nurse Network. And our ultimate mission is to have a group of nurses funded around the world to provide extra support for people affected by rare disease.
Great, thank you so much, Neil. So that is our amazing panel this afternoon, and what a treat to be able to join this panel. And We're going to kick off with a very general question, which each of the panelists will have time to address. And then we'll go back to the panelists with individual questions, and then we will be getting questions from the audience that we will be pitching to each of them. So the first big question for this panel is, what on earth can governments and civil society do to incentivize research and development for areas of high risk but less commercial value? So how on earth can we incentivize governments and civil society to address these issues that you've just raised? So to start off, Tiina, tell us what to do.
So I think part of it is raising awareness and letting people know what rare diseases actually are. In many countries in the European Union, it's 1 in less than 2,000 people are considered to have a rare disease. In the US, it's less than 200,000 individuals. So when people hear that, they think, well, this doesn't impact a lot of people. So how important can that be? But if you look at the numbers of how many rare diseases there are over 7,000 rare diseases. And if you start adding up the numbers, it's approximately 30 million people in the US that have a rare disease, and that's 1 in 10 people. And that's slightly less than have diabetes, and that's more than have HIV, Alzheimer's disease, or all cancers combined. So I think an awareness and an understanding that this is a large public health issue and not just one-off bits and pieces is very important for government leaders to understand, and then to help bring together the different rare disease groups to understand that they have a louder voice when they work together and work collaboratively in looking at different areas.
Great, thank you very much, Tiina. Can I just push you though on something about
Sure.
about having a louder voice if the message is collective? So in a previous conversation with you, you had mentioned the issue about one of the problems is that collective voice can't happen because, particularly for raising money and charities, it's the individual voices that speak the loudest and also get the most attention. So could you just expand on that before I move on to Manos?
Sure. So sometimes I say some rare diseases are more popular than others or better known, like ALS. ALS usually happens when an
just because we've got a really mixed audience, I've been told off for using acronyms. So ALS.
Dr.
Motor neuron disease. Yeah.
Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis.
Thank you. As I just went blank on that, I was like, oh, thank you. I just went blank, sorry. So ALS occurs in adults. It happens in adulthood. Individuals are often in a point in their life where they're well set professionally and they can go out and let people know. Their friends and colleagues might work for large companies. They get a lot of attention, like the large ALS Ice Bucket Challenge. Whereas other rare diseases are less better known. Pompe disease is a disorder that occurs in young children that if it happens in a baby, you know, the family knows, the people who are near them know, but the greater community does not hear about this specific rare disease. So there's a little bit of an unbalance of the popular rare diseases and the less well-known rare diseases.
Great. Thank you very much, Tiina. I think we'll maybe come back to that in the discussion in terms of
Sure.
you know, the attention given to different rare diseases and how to engage best with society. Anyway, thank you so much, Tiina. So over to you, Manos. From your perspective, how can governments and civil society incentivize more work in this area, more attention, and what are the best models? Manos.
Thank you, Alison, and I will take a few moments, if you don't mind, to describe some of my experience where civil society, government, the private sector work together to really change the course of a disease, and that disease is HIV/AIDS. I worked in that space starting in '95, and for those of you who either were around at the time or might look back, you will know that in the early '90s, HIV was a death sentence, and today, of course, it's a terrible disease that affects millions, but it's no longer a death sentence if you can be on the appropriate treatment, and that's a space where pretty much everything, when you look at the history, pretty much everything went as well as it could have gone. This is a space where governments invested massive amounts of money and significant effort in R&D and discovered basic mechanisms that led to drugs, which the private sector invented and developed and commercialized. Physicians embraced the new paradigms and started treating their patients in ways that today has made HIV into a chronic treatable disease. For those of you who can look at the mortality curves, you will see that the curve of mortality for HIV infected subjects is actually pretty close to that for healthy subjects today. So in the space of 2 decades, we changed the course of the disease, and with the access programs that are in place today, that's also changing in countries that did not have access to those treatments previously. So this is what it looks like when it works. I would like to speak of the 2 areas that I am more familiar with today, and these are the neglected tropical diseases and antimicrobial resistance. And these are 2 areas where, unfortunately, pretty much everything I described to you for HIV, which went well, is actually not going well for both of those areas. First of all, in terms of basic research, there has been a resurgence, and there is a lot of good work, don't misunderstand me. But if you compare the amount of work and money invested in basic research, academic research, in both those spaces, either neglected tropical diseases or antimicrobial resistance, it's a fraction of the effort that we made in HIV/AIDS.
Manos, I'm just going to interrupt you there. Just could you give us an example or 2 of neglected tropical diseases? Just maybe your top 3 favorite ones or interesting ones, just so the audience have some tangible examples. Thank you.
Absolutely. Tuberculosis, probably around 2 million deaths last year from that disease alone. And it affects some patients in the countries where we live and work, but much more patients in developing countries where the treatments are less available and harder to take. Malaria, dengue, leishmaniasis. So these are diseases which are deadly, debilitating. They place a huge burden on families and patients, of course, but also on the countries that where they are found.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, carry on. I just wanted tangible examples. Back to you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Alison. So going back to the point, if you're looking at R&D in neglected tropical diseases, on the academic side, there has been a resurgence. And for those of you familiar with the space, you will have heard the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And I would say that without the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, neglected tropical diseases would probably be 20 years behind where we are today. We have seen a number of treatments, new treatments come to the clinic, but nowhere near the number or the breadth that we would need to really solve those problems. Equally for antimicrobial resistance, there are a number of academic institutes with very capable scientists, but the space has seen a disinvestment and a loss of talent. So for those of you who work in this space or want to work in a space where you can actually make a big difference, this is one space where you can do that. When it comes to the private sector, there is no driver for profit. Obviously, neglected tropical diseases affect countries which are not traditional commercial markets. And again, governments developed country governments to a degree, but also nonprofits, are putting money behind this, but it's a not-for-profit level of funding. It's less than 1% of what a big pharmaceutical company would invest in a single for-profit disease. Is corporate responsibility, social responsibility, rather than core business, and this is an important distinction. For tropical diseases, once again, nonprofits are driving this for antimicrobial resistance, because this is a disease that actually does not disproportionately affect developing world countries. It affects our countries as much, or perhaps even more. It's not an area where nonprofits actually are investing large sums of money as they do in tropical diseases. And so this is a space where the market is not driving private investment. And to answer your question, Alison, this is a place where the greatest challenge is not scientific, even though there are scientific challenges, but it's more political and economic. Last but not least, I will speak to medical use, where the way in which the products are prescribed in antimicrobial resistant infections is changing, but probably not fast enough. We still see probably overprescription of antibiotics, or prescription of the wrong antibiotics, which might not work and propagate resistance. And this is an area where diagnostics can make a difference, and also a change in the way in which we apply we prescribe the available treatments with much more targeted use of the right antibiotic for the right patient, and shifting from a model of large volume of broad spectrum agents that are prescribed to everyone, to one where we use those agents more sparingly, in a more targeted way, and in ways that patients can actually benefit, but also the community, through containing the development of resistance. So how to incentivize governments and the civil society? Twofold. Make it a priority. Awareness, to Tiina's point, is important, and bringing it to the top of the political agenda is important. The United Kingdom has played a leadership role over the last few years, with Dame Sally Davis, Chief Medical Officer for England, being a world-leading voice in having to change the way in which we tackle antimicrobial resistance, and the O'Neill report by Jim O'Neill, who also outlined the impact on both the society functioning and on patients globally. So please make sure that this stays on top of the agenda for our governments, and also please realize that unfortunately, like everything in life, one gets what one pays for, and new treatments for rare diseases, which now are not affecting millions of patients for antimicrobial resistance, but maybe hundreds of thousands, will have to be priced and paid for in different ways than treatments that were broadly prescribed to millions of patients. And that's a debate in which we need to engage, both in making sure that there is investment in R&D, in making sure that the drugs that we are inventing and developing are going to be profitable, so that it can be more investment for more products.
Great, thank you very much, Manos. So some really, really kind of meaty topics covered, and the issue about antimicrobial optimization and preservation, I hope we'll maybe get back to in the discussion, as that's just got to be something for civil society as well as governments, civil society will have to take it forwards, I feel. I also just wanted to comment on the issue about the HIV experience. So just, early in the late 80s, I remember being in the thick of it as a junior doctor, and quite extraordinary what we were facing and having to deal with, and just the change, quite amazing. Okay, onwards. So now we're going to hear from Neil. So Neil Dugdale, nice introduction. Now tell us how you'd solve the world's problems. Thank you.
Okay, we may not have long enough for that, Alison. And Manos is a very powerful man to follow. and it made some very, very good points. I think what I'd like to do is first of all build on what Tiina said, and she talked about rare disease affecting 30 million people in the US, and I think that there's some really key points about rare disease which everybody needs to understand as to why it's so important that we take it so seriously. So Tiina said 7,000, approximately 7,000 rare diseases. Of those 7,000, there are very few that actually have an effective treatment. Approximately 300 to 350 treatments exist. So huge, huge unmet need. Most of those rare diseases affect people from a very early age, if not birth. So massive impact on the baby and the child, but also on that baby's family, which everybody needs to consider. The average time to diagnosis, and this is in the developed nations with developed healthcare, so it's worse when you go outside of those so-called developed nations when it comes to healthcare. But the average time to diagnosis is 5 years. So 5 years before a family gets a diagnosis of what's been affecting their child, possibly since birth. And obviously that's an average. So some quicker, but obviously some a lot longer. So it's a massive, massive problem. And whilst it might only affect a small number of people, because there's so many rare diseases, we have this forecast from various sources that basically it affects about 350 million people globally, which is pretty much the population of the United States of America. So as far as rare diseases are concerned, it's a massive, massive problem. In terms of solving the problems, that's a very difficult one. I think one of your questions was, how can we incentivize governments and how can we incentivize change? And I watched the BBC News and highlight certain political exchange between two US politicians. And it may be that we don't always look to the US now for leadership in certain areas, but actually they do something quite unique in healthcare, which is the FDA vouchers. So when it comes to something that's desperate for new research, or if someone has a product that looks particularly exciting, you can get a voucher to accelerate review. And if you don't use that voucher, you can sell it and you can invest that money into additional research. And I think that that's something that other countries could look at copying, because there is no doubt that we have to look at incentivizing governments to do more about this. And I think my final point about incentivizing the government is a bit parochial in terms of the fact it's only the UK, but Brexit has happened. It's not happening, it has happened. It happened at the end of last year. And we have until the end of this year to reach an agreement. But whatever happens moving forward, the science industry in the UK is hugely important for this country and for this economy. And what we need really is a scientific revolution, because without a scientific revolution, without more science, we're not going to see the economy grow back to the levels that the government and all of us as UK residents want to see. So the government needs to look at this and say, okay, how can we really incentivize our scientific companies to invest in the right areas? And with such an unmet need in rare disease, you hope that that would lead to even more innovative models to encourage research into rare disease treatment.
Great. Thank you very much. I think what was extraordinary from you and from Tiina is actually, we're calling these rare diseases, and maybe the whole language that's being used is not helpful when you actually diminish the scale of the issue by saying they're rare, because what you've described and what Tiina's described, you really highlight the scale of this challenge. So really interesting. Okay, so thank you very much. So we're getting questions streaming in now. So I'm going to pick some of them and randomly direct them to people. And the first one is about looking at antimicrobial resistance. Can I just say, this is no bias, this is what's coming through. And in terms of how do we manage and how do we make it worthwhile to develop new drugs whilst preserving old drugs? So I'm going to, and there's a variety of themes linked to that. I'm going to ask Manos first about this. And then I also want to consider what we can learn from the neglected diseases and the rare diseases as well. And I wonder, Manos, in your answer, if you could maybe comment on some amazing kind of economic models that are being developed in the UK as well to maybe help with this issue of supporting drug development. Anyway, over to you, Manos.
Thank you, Alison. It's a very broad range of questions. So To your first question, the solution to fighting antimicrobial resistance is both using the drugs that we already have in a more appropriate way and inventing and developing and commercializing, bringing new products to the hospitals. So the O'Neill report, which is now a few years old, but unfortunately hasn't really changed the trajectory much, was estimating probably about 700,000 deaths a year globally from antimicrobial resistance. That probably is a very vast underestimate because most of these are not reported. But by 2050, I believe the number was 10 million each year. So that's more than deaths due to cancer, plus road accidents, plus diabetes put together. So it is the next pandemic, but it's a slow pandemic. I think the awareness of that, to your point, Alison, is changing some of the behaviors. We are seeing probably more careful use of antibiotics in hospitals, at least, where physicians are more considered on which antibiotic to use. Don't reach for the latest drug unless you believe that your patients will need that. Unfortunately, the way in which those products are being developed has not really changed since they've been around. And if you look at the product labels, which is what tells physicians how to use the products, they still read the same way as they read 40 or 50 years ago. So an antibiotic will say for the treatment of urinary tract infections, where in fact there are urinary tract infections and there are urinary tract infections. There are some that you can treat with a single dose or with a short course of fluoroquinolone, and there are others which require you to be hospitalized and given an IV drip for 2 weeks. What we are doing at my company and very few others, unfortunately, but it's getting there, is getting antibiotics studied in the patient populations for which they are needed. And so you could end up with an antibiotic, if you're successful, where the label says for the treatment of drug-resistant urinary tract infections due to those pathogens, or for the treatment of drug-resistant pneumonia. So this is one step, but to your point, these are going to be treatments that are not going to be used in millions of patients. They're going to be used in thousands. We estimate the burden in the US, which is a market I'm more familiar with, to probably a couple of 100,000 a year for hospital gram-negative infections that require those new products. And so the pricing model and the commercial model, to your point, Alison, will have to be different. There are a number of discussions, unfortunately no action yet, that are looking at different ways of reimbursing drugs. The UK is running a pilot experiment where they're looking to pay the companies for the development of antibiotic with a subscription model rather than for sales. That's a great principle, but if you look at the numbers, the devil's in the detail. For a private company to invest in those products, the number needs to be as big as it would be if it invested in a rare disease or oncology, and those numbers are not there yet. There are other initiatives that are looking to take, which are more technical, which look to effectively allow the companies to price the products commensurate with the volume that they're going to be sold at. Some of the diseases that we work on, we're looking at 20 or 30,000 patients a year, so they're not unlike orphan diseases or very rare diseases that we just discussed. But the pricing for those orphan diseases is very different to the one for antibiotics.
Great, thank you. Manos, thank you very much for that. And I think that's really interesting, the idea of kind of value-based models. I'm going to move on there, but I'm going to want to come back to you about something you said earlier, which was about diagnostics. And we've got, these amazing entrepreneurs in our audience. So I wouldn't mind coming back to actually not just the economic models, but maybe some of the technological opportunities in diagnostics and ones that are appropriate in a global context. So maybe we could come back to that later. So I want to move to Neil now about incentivizing. I also want you to tell us about how can you not just incentivize, but speed up the action. So what can be learned from the rare diseases in terms of incentivizing, but also the need to really speed up responses? Neil.
Thank you, Alison. I think, like I said, I think there has to be some financial incentives, and there's just been a question which I've just replied to. You have to understand that from the pharmaceutical industry's perspective, it takes 20 years to get a product to market, costs billions, and there's lots and lots of different estimates. But it's a huge cost because so many products fail on the way. So for them to work in an area where there's very little previous research, there's very few patients, there's very few clinicians with experience of a rare disease, it's so difficult to take that risk. And it's much easier to stay in areas where they have done previous research, they have expertise, they have knowledge, they can bring out new improved products, and they can still make the profit, which the shareholders depend on, and many of our pension funds depend on, et cetera, et cetera. The need for a profitable pharmaceutical industry is absolutely paramount, and people have to accept that. But in terms of other ways to incentivize apart from financial incentives or apart from government incentives, I've done some research amongst sort of 3 groups to prepare for this panel. The Ardent group, which I talked about, which is run and led very much by Joe Balfour from the Cambridge Rare Disease Network, and Lucy McKay, who is the CEO of Medics for Rare Disease. There's a huge number of patient groups involved with that group, and it's a learning experience every time we have a meeting for me personally to listen to their ideas. I've got some feedback from them about how we can do things differently, and also from the chairman of Helix, which is a Cambridge company specializing in rare disease and looking at artificial intelligence. And the feedback that comes through is that there seems to be a lot of research that takes place in many academia centers, which doesn't necessarily link in or connect with medical clinicians, physicians who have experience within there. So you have lots and lots of useful research, which must be very good for people to get their names on papers. But what is it producing? And I think they feel that a very, very useful way to really make more gains in some areas is to insist that research has a medical component, has a physician treating patients, experienced in the area, that can point that research in the right direction. So not only do we get some useful scientific facts out of that research, we potentially get new products for new diseases. And I think that was a really, really great idea to be able to put over to this audience. The other feedback I had, which was again really I thought quite unique and very powerful, is the use of patient groups, particularly within the rare disease setting. Is that the experts are the patients themselves and the patient's family, and occasionally the physicians, but nobody knows what it's like to live with a rare disease apart from someone who has a rare disease. And I don't have any personal experience of it myself, so what I've learned is from people involved in this area. And the idea is that any research taking place into a rare disease should have patient group involvement, because the patient group would really help that research be as targeted as possible. And I'll give you an example. It's very difficult with a small number of patients to get any kind of powerful research to perhaps get evidence that the treatment actually works. And sometimes it might not be a normal parameter that actually makes a difference. It could be, can that patient walk further? What is that patient's activities of daily living? If there's a small improvement in activity of day, that can be a massive difference for that person. So we may not get treatments that are a cure, but treatments might mean that that patient lives a healthy life and goes on and has children themselves that are completely unaffected by this very rare genetic anomaly in their genome. So you've got these ideas from these people that I view as experts and I learn from all the time. And I think that if we could join up the research, join up the clinicians into the research and also the patient groups, then quite quickly we could make some good gains within the rare disease field.
Brilliant. Those are some really important points. Thank you very much, Neil. I'm going to bring Tiina in here in a moment. I think it's important that we also start thinking about geography. So can we begin to think about kind of the unmet needs and the kind of inequity in terms of geography as well, and begin to think about that. So Tiina, I want to pick up with you this issue about working across groups. We touched on it before about, the difficulties and potentially the tensions in terms of incentivizing across small diseases versus grouping together. And And just, I wonder if you could maybe describe what are the opportunities in terms of kind of working across groups. Neil was talking about it in terms of patient groups, but also in terms of academic specialties, making sure there was some kind of applied research that was done that involved the kind of frontline clinicians as well as carers and individual patients. But could you maybe expand on the opportunities of working collaboratively across groups of diseases or geographies or specialties, and how can we maybe use this to help address these needs?
Absolutely. So the program that I work with very closely is called the Rare Disease Clinical Research Network. And what we have is a network of consortia that look at rare diseases. We have 20 different consortia. Each consortia has to look at 3 different rare diseases, and each consortia has to have patient advocacy group involved in them. And the focus that we're doing in this cycle of our Rare Disease Clinical Research Network is clinical trial readiness. And it's that preparedness to kind of de-risk all the challenges that have been faced in the past. And, you know, like 3 major challenges are, you know, things are really expensive. You know, how can we do this more cheaply? It's the economies of scale. Share the work environment, share the tools that you're using. So we've put things in a cloud environment. They can share the tools, so you're not paying for your research resources 20 times over. The patient advocacy groups that we work with that are involved with the rare disease, the disease groups, some of them are very mature and, you know, very well heeled and have a lot of support. And some are moms and dads just coming together to bring things together. So we bring everyone to the table. So the new groups that are coming on can learn from the more senior groups, the tools that they've already developed to communicate. How did you raise money? How do you reach out to your families? How do you provide them support? Can be shared in this more of a community setting. And that most people think of that for the families, but we also do that for researchers. You know, how do you do better outreach? How do you get a more diverse sample for your rare disease patients? You know, you have a primarily white sample. How do you reach out to different groups to get them to be involved in these research studies? Clinicians from different areas. When we look at the rare diseases that we have, you can look at them, you know, they can be very different, but in the genetic area, they can be on the same pathway. So people can be studying the same pathway, they can learn from each other. You know, they have a similar organ system involved, or the rare diseases that have multiple organ systems. These physician researchers or basic scientists don't often talk to each other. And if they do, they're often talking, you know, in different terminology, different jargon. It's bringing them together at the same table, because at the end of the day, everybody wants the same thing. Everybody wants cure.
So we've got
Sure.
an audience here of different stages of their life. I think quite many of them are quite young and with studying different subjects. Do you have a message? So you're talking about different groups getting together, but
Right.
how can people that are embarking on research or R&D careers or entrepreneurs, or how could they maybe more effectively contribute to this? How can they use their skills more, or work across skills or approaches?
If you think of bioinformaticians, people in bioinformatics, building tools that these groups can use, helping develop data standards, different software that can be used across things. So things aren't disease specific. The institute I work for, we try, much of the National Institutes of Health their focus is very disease specific. We try to be disease agnostic at our center. So it's like, what are you building? What are you developing? Can you use it for more than one disease? great. we're all for that, because if you keep building one-offs of anything you do, it's not going to work. But you need to also learn when you're working, when you're a clinician, a nurse, a doctor. We have a lot of projects where they work with engineers to develop different tools and such that help the physicians, that can help the patients. I guess what I would say is be open to learning from other people and to teaching other people what you know, and don't be boxed into, I'm only going to study one disease, because there's so much more you can learn from other diseases. You can have fresh insight.
I think that's a really, really important message. I mean, we were talking about silos in terms of diseases and approaches, but actually it's really important in terms of hybrid skills and people being able to work across professions and academic backgrounds to address this and be able to flex across things. So one of the other things that we need to think about in terms of flexing is questions coming through about not just preserving agents and developing new drugs, but how can we repurpose? How can we not just, how can we stop ourselves from working in silos in terms of the agents that we've got for therapies? And I'm going to ask Neil here to tell us about how we can perhaps repurpose existing agents to help with the conditions that we've been discussing. Neil.
Thanks, Alison. I think the other thing I'd add just to that last discussion is just in terms of anybody involved in research, anybody doing any kind of scientific research, I would really urge them to try and look outside of the group that they're within. So whether it be a university or a private institution, is it linked to any patient group that they can find? If it's a rare disease research, can they link up with the national rare disease body for that country? Or if it's in the European Union, why don't they contact Eurodis and find out what information Eurodis has on what they're working on? What I've learned, it's about building bridges. It's about building connections, and you never know what the next connection will lead to. But if you work in a silo, it's probably going to fail, or it won't do as much good as it can do. So that's what I would urge in terms of the conversation that you were just having with Tiina. I just replied to the question on the chat box, but there's a wonderful example of repurposing, and it does involve SOBI actually, in a treatment that SOBI had for a rare disease. And there's a rare disease called alkaptonuria, AKU. And I said AKU, but I have explained what the abbreviation is, Alison, so you can't come back to me about that one. But if people look up the AKU Society, they should be able to read about a gentleman called Nick Siro, who again I talked to about his ideas in terms of how we can improve rare disease treatments before this panel. Nick's story is inspirational. It's I think it's unique. I think it's the first example of a product being repurposed to treat another rare disease, and it came about because he had two boys, both born with the same rare disease, and I think from within 5 days of birth, the urine was black. And obviously that was not something that they were that was normal. And he went on a quest. And 17 years later, this year, the CHMP gave a positive opinion for a treatment for AKU. And it's all down to Nick's persistence. People.
CHMP?
CHMP, Committee for Human Medicinal Products, and a very important body to get through to be able to license a product and bring it to market for those people affected. So fantastic work and a really amazing example of what can be done. And I mentioned other company, Helix. Helix is based in Cambridge, are using artificial intelligence to look at treatments that are already available to see if any of them would be suitable for a range of rare diseases. And I think they've got a number of promising candidates. So the work is happening, but we've now got a really great example with Nick and the AKU Society of what can be achieved for patients with rare diseases. And I think that I'd encourage everybody to look at that story because it's a hugely positive story.
Great, thank you very much, Neil. And then getting back to you, Manos, before we talk about opportunities with technology and innovation to optimize and existing agents as well as new ones that may potentially come through, is there anything that you would like to add around the idea of repurposing in terms of preserving what we already have? So if you could first talk a little bit about opportunities for repurposing, and then move into how could technology and innovation maybe support preserving drugs and the issue about drug-resistant infection.
Yeah, absolutely. So repurposing opportunities in antibacterial and tropical disease research is a little bit more challenging. You can repurpose products to work in different pathogens within the same subfamily, but there's very little in common between the malaria parasite and tuberculosis bacterium. So that kind of repurposing is not very fruitful, but we have seen a number of companies in recent years taking all products off the shelf that have been developed in a certain way and focusing their development more in the subset of disease where the medical need was higher. I would like to go back to that cross-boundary research because that's really important, and that is one that even if you can't repurpose the product, you can learn a lot about the science. And again, to go back to my own experience in HIV, the product that I contributed to discovering and developing is actually a molecule that targets a chemokine receptor, which was an inflammation target. It's an immune system target rather than a viral target. And this was a great example of how looking beyond the boundaries of your immediate area of research can generate innovation. Before going to the technology question, Alison, I would like to say a few words about industry, medical need, and drug pricing, because a lot of that is a hot topic for antibacterials. And again, I gave you my experience in HIV. The gene CCR5 was discovered in '96. Just over a decade later, in 2007, the product that targets that receptor and blocks HIV entry was approved. And that's 11 years. I worked on that product for all that time. And I can tell you the amount of investment, both on the academic side, from the company I was working for at the time, on the private side, made that happen. The global investment in R&D from pharmaceutical companies, an estimate, is 165 billion each year. And I can tell you from experience, having worked in tropical diseases and tuberculosis, where the estimate is probably closer to $500 million a year, you can do a lot more with $1 billion than you can with $500 million. And it's important that we find a way to incentivize private investment, both in rare diseases, in AMR, and in tropical diseases. The amount of money to be had is simply too large for any government or even combination of governments to spend. But let me tell you, because most of you probably don't have a retirement account for the audience I'm speaking, but they might have bank accounts. My company is a public company. You can go out and buy shares at Entasis Therapeutics, and actually right now might be a great time to buy them, but I hope you didn't buy them 5 years ago. So we've been around for 5 years, and when we went public, our shares were priced at $15. If you had bought them at the time, you would be holding $2 in your hands today. And if you want companies like us, and also Big Pharma, to invest in the space of antimicrobial resistance, neglected tropical diseases, you can't expect, as in the same way that you wouldn't want to put 15 in and get 2 back, nobody else does. So we need to find a way to make the products that we're developing profitable in order to get a share of that 165 billion a year that pharma invests in finding new treatments. So medical need is important. I'm a scientist, like probably most of you or many of you. I've had the fortune to work on a number of projects. One of them became a drug. I want our products to be available to patients. There's no point doing all this work, to Neil's point, decades of work and billions of dollars for a product to sit on a shelf. I want the products to be available to patients wherever they may be. I want them to be available to patients in developing world countries who also suffer from bacterial infections. But for us to find a solution like we eventually did in HIV, it took too long, but we did get there. There needs to be products for us to take. And the challenge that we have today is because of the way in which those products are reimbursed, and perhaps used, there is no economic driver for either investing in tropical diseases or investing in antimicrobial resistance. It's a kind of a long way to come to your question, Alison, which is technology that will help us get there. So in terms of new products, as I mentioned, the challenge is not so much technological or scientific as much as economic incentives. For the use, it's a different question. So for hospitals and prescribers to become more thoughtful about the way in which they prescribe drugs, they need to have more information. And that's where diagnostic technologies become really important. In the UK, there was the Longitude Prize, which was launched to incentivize new diagnostics for antimicrobial resistance. There was an equivalent prize in the US. And a number of companies are working in this space. The idea is that if you know quickly enough what pathogen or pathogens afflict your patient, you can make a better informed choice for the product that you will use. We actually are developing our products with the assumption that by the time they get to the patients, there will be those diagnosed on the market. Two products are in phase 3, so we have a couple of years to get there. The technology is certainly around, but once again, we need to race to the goal line for that.
So, I mean, I think it's also interesting that we should be considering, immunotherapy and other approaches as well to the management of infectious diseases. I mean, of course, we haven't yet touched upon the role of vaccines, and also in terms of repurposing, thinking of the kind of One Health agenda and drugs in one sector that may be useful. So this could be a really, really broad discussion here, that optimization of use will also involve prevention and other means of managing infections. So one thing we haven't touched upon so well is the issue that came through in the questions earlier, which is about geographic inequity. So I'm going to go back. So this is not geographic, this is not just the issue in terms of infectious diseases, but the whole issue about geographic inequity in terms of healthcare needs and some of these diseases that we're talking about. So I wonder if we could spend a little bit of time on that. I mean, we talked about networks, about getting groups together, working across silos, the importance of multidisciplinary working, making sure that science links to need. But I also just wonder if we could address some of these questions that have come through about, the global issue, and things don't only happen in certain parts of the world, and how best to deal with that. So I'm going to go back to Neil here, and then I'm going to Tiina, and then to Manos. So just about addressing things in terms of unmet needs and geographic inequity from your perspective and from your particular expertise. So Neil.
So okay, I think that there's a couple of things I'd like to say. First of all, I think when you're listening to Manos speak, and what he said earlier about tuberculosis, and I think 2 million people will die from tuberculosis, and the estimates I think so far that I've read about the number of fatalities around the globe from COVID, I think it's about 1 million. Now, some countries may have underreported, but it's amazing to think how much investment and research is going into COVID compared to how much is going into tuberculosis. And at the moment, tuberculosis kills twice as many people. So it's staggering really to hear that, Manos, and I wasn't aware of that. And I think, obviously, it's a very difficult question. There is a good example within the rare disease community of where treatments have been donated by companies and made a huge difference around the world. So it's a rare disease. It's haemophilia. There's 2 different forms of haemophilia: haemophilia A, haemophilia B. The companies involved in treatments for haemophilia have donated huge amounts of product to the World Federation of Haemophilia, and the World Federation of Haemophilia is in charge of distributing that to areas of need. And there have been thousands of operations performed on people with haemophilia that without the factor replacement, they would have bled and they would have died. There's been children who are now on regular prophylaxis, so they're not getting the side effects, the devastating side effects that haemophilia can bring if it's not untreated. So there are examples within the rare disease, examples within haemophilia where donation programs have really helped. And you think that is a very important role for any world patient organization. So the more established diseases tend to have a world association. Hopefully pharmaceutical companies would donate to that, and that could make a real difference in some areas. I'm not sure whether it's going to work in neglected tropical diseases because it's really not an area of mine. But then you think maybe the World Health Organization could play a leadership role on this. And that's maybe where we could look. But there is a good example within haemophilia that people can learn from, Alison.
Great, thanks very much, Neil. Tiina, thoughts on kind of addressing unmet needs, but kind of global perspective? Tiina.
Well, I think one of the challenges with rare diseases is not just the treatment, it's a diagnosis. Yeah. The individuals with rare diseases are often on what's referred to as a diagnostic odyssey, which can take 5 to 7 years to, if lucky, to diagnose some individuals with rare disease, finding the doctors. So it's finding getting a proper diagnosis so that you can get the proper treatment, and getting the clinicians to have a strong understanding of the natural history of that disease so they know who to treat and when to treat and why to treat. So I think the diagnostics are a very, very important part of finding the patients. You can look all over the world. It's very hard to find and diagnose patients. And again, it comes to education and having more primary care physicians be more aware of rare diseases and such.
Great, thank you very much, Tiina. And Manos, over to you. Geographic inequities, how can we address them?
So thank you, Alison, and very, very different picture for neglected tropical diseases versus some of the other diseases that we have discussed. Obviously, you do get some tuberculosis patients in the UK or Europe, but the vast majority will be in countries that can't really afford to pay a lot for that treatment. And Neil, to your point, there is a very simple and sad reason in a way why there is so much more investment in COVID than there is in tuberculosis, and it's simply that fact. COVID is on our doorsteps. Tuberculosis is, for most of us, somewhere else. That's unfortunate. As a scientist, as a researcher in pharmaceuticals, I deplore that, but that is the reality of working in the for-profit space. In neglected tropical diseases, as I mentioned earlier, things have improved. We have had infusion of cash from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that has triggered other investments from governments. And then we found a way to make those products available, which is really good, because otherwise there really is no point. So organizations like the Drug for Neglected Disease Initiative, for instance, who partner with local manufacturers, really subsidized by grants from Western governments to produce and distribute products at a very low margin. And the same happens for HIV. And again, when I was summarizing my experience earlier, I said almost everything went well. The one thing that I wish we could have gotten better was making those products available to those countries that were suffering most from the epidemic. And back in the late 90s and early 2000s, there were still plenty of reasons why these were not being made available there. We were worried about promoting emergence of resistance. We were worried about products being re-imported at low price in some of the commercial markets, but none of that happened. And today it's still not perfect, but the majority of modern HIV drugs are available at a deep discount for those patients who can't afford them. I hope we learn from that. When it comes to antimicrobial resistance, it's strangely enough, the disparity is the other way, because AMR happens when you use antibiotics more, and we use antibiotics more where we have them. So a number of developing world countries have alarmingly high rates, but others where antibiotics are actually not widely available, that isn't the case. So AMR is an epidemic on our doorsteps, and it's relatively frustrating because it's a slow epidemic, unlike COVID that is growing fast, we're not yet jumping out of that frying pan to a better place.
Great, thank you very much. We may be able to talk a little bit more about that at the end. So the issue about AMR, like climate change, will be there. It's coming. It's already here. It's going to be still here. It may be worse. We maybe have time at the end. There's some brilliant questions coming through. So I want to pick one of these up, which is really interesting about how can we use telemedicine and remote clinical trials to recruit patients from all over the world and facilitate and encourage research. Really interesting. So I would like your thoughts on that, the good and the bad about telemedicine, but the major opportunities now offered, and how could they best be employed in the areas that you work in to address some of these unmet needs that we've been discussing. So Neil, you're first.
Well, you've got me on this one. It's a great, I think that we have discussed this actually in the Ardent group, and what we're finding within the rare disease community is that there's a lot of patients suffering because of the shutdown of hospitals, the shutdown of clinics, the shutdown of trials, the pausing of trials. It's a massive problem, and people are trying to, I think, pandemic-proof future clinical trials by making sure that it can be done as remotely as possible. The issue then becomes the power of the trial, because finding enough patients is one thing within rare disease, but if you don't control the trial well enough and there's not a placebo arm and a randomized arm, then you're going to have problems down the line improving the power of that medication. So it's a really good question, and it's a really difficult one to answer. The fact is, if you look at, and again, I'll talk mainly about the UK has probably jumped 10 years in terms of its use of technology within the primary care field, within seeing GPs. Most appointments now are telephone or video. You don't go and see a GP physically unless you really have to. A lot of referrals are being made, and then you get a video or a phone call from a hospital. So we have accelerated our adoption of technology in the UK because of COVID. So there's positives happening there, and you hope that that might make a difference. I think the problem with specifically rare disease is sometimes people, it's so complex. They are seeing multiple people, multiple specialties within a hospital before a diagnosis is made. Whether that can be done remotely, I think remains to be seen. And I think that there's still massive complications in getting the diagnosis in the first place, never mind finding an effective treatment or even a way to manage the side effects. It's a great question, and I think that I'm going to have to ponder that a bit more to be able to be a bit more eloquent.
Great, that's superb. Thank you, Neil. So Tiina.
So some of our researchers, the same as with Neil, they found themselves in the middle of a protocol or research study and have had to either stop or make amendments to their protocols. I think the treatments, I think that a lot of the doctors and the families, we have heard very positive responses that they're happy that they don't have to travel. A lot of the kids or adults with rare diseases are too ill to travel. So this makes it easier for them. So that's the beneficial side. It's the quality of the study, as Neil said, can come into question, the types of studies that you can do, how reliable the information will be. I think that will all come with time. I think the technologists out there among you could be inventing things and developing things to make things easier, better, to get a better exam virtually, that the family could participate in, or if it's a clinical trial, they could go to their local clinician to go through the steps with them to participate. But I think it's definitely the wave of the future and direction we're going in rare disease studies, at least.
Great, thank you, Tiina. And there's some major opportunities in infectious diseases in terms of surveillance and geospatial mapping, and many opportunities. Manos, thoughts, telemedicine, remote trials?
For better or worse, the kind of disease that that we're talking about when it comes to tropical diseases or AMR do not require telemedicine. These are short treatments. Most trials that are conducted in those diseases are actually global. Our own trials today are running on 5 continents. We're looking at patients from around the globe. And to your point, Alison, when a pharmaceutical company develops a new antibiotic, it's part of our commitment with the regulators to continue surveillance of microbes from around the globe. So for our lead program, which is targeting Acinetobacter, we have over 5,500 strains from all around the globe that we have tested against the product and know how well it will work. So these are global diseases that affect patients around the globe, and the majority of companies like us, we're 45, but we still figured a way to run our trials in North and South America, Europe, Asia, Africa.
Fantastic, thank you. So we're coming to the end of this panel discussion. It's been truly wonderful. I am going to go around and ask each of our amazing panelists to say a few words that would actually incentivize you to maybe seek a career or develop innovation or be involved in the economics and the support for these areas. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists to say an incredibly inspiring sentence or two before we wrap up, to encourage audience members. Thank you so much, by the way, for the fantastic questions coming through. It's really, really, really tremendous. And then we'll wrap up. So I'm wanting vision and inspiration. Firstly, from Tiina, over to you. Inspire us.
So I would say working in this area for me has been very, very satisfying. I look at the patients, and every small thing you could do to make their life better is important and is very valued by the patients and by the families. It's a very rewarding area to work in. I think if you like working with teams, you work with teams of people. You can pick one rare disease for 5 years and then move on to another rare disease when you've found a cure for that. There's ability to move around, so you're not stuck in a niche or you're not siloed away in something. But mostly they're wonderful, caring people to work with. And I don't care whether it's an informatics person that I found in this field or an engineer who's developed a new tool to use for newborn screening. They're very motivated because everybody wants the same thing. They want to find a cure or a treatment for that patient, and they're all doing their part to get it there. So you'd be part of a great team.
Tiina, fantastic. Thank you. Manos.
Thank you, Alison. Look, I told you many reasons. I give you many reasons why working in neglected tropical diseases or AMR is hard. It's really tough. And I would like to give you one that makes me stay in this space and spend most of my career in this space. And that's the experience I had when I was fortunate to get the product that I worked on as a research scientist. I did the very first in vitro experiments to get this licensed and prescribed to patients, and actually met some of those patients whose lives were saved by the product that I worked on. There's nothing like it. There's nothing like working on something that with a short course of treatment or a chronic treatment will save a person's life. And it's not easy. You might go decades without that fortune of seeing this happen. But if you work in this space, you got a chance of actually achieving that. And if that drives you, there's no better place to work.
Wonderful. Thank you, Manos. Neil.
I think that I've probably worked in a number of therapy areas in my career, and I've enjoyed all of them. I think the two that stand out are actually poles apart, because it's Alzheimer's disease and it's rare disease. The thing for me about both of those disease areas, and obviously I'm talking about rare disease now particularly, is the ability you have to make a difference to people's lives, which you don't get when you work in an area where there's thousands or hundreds of thousands of people affected. Within the rare disease community, you will meet people who have been affected by a rare disease, or children have been affected by rare disease. And the fact that you can either help them with a diagnosis or a treatment can make a massive difference to that family. One of the questions that came up just now is about, why is a diagnosis important if there's no effective treatment? And all I can say is, if you can imagine what it's like to have a child that is ill constantly, which is not developing like the baby group that you're with when you become a parent, that is not able to read at a certain age, is not able to speak at a certain age, cannot walk, cannot crawl, and you don't know what's wrong with them. It's heartbreaking. And when you eventually find out what is wrong with that child or that baby, at least you have something that you can then go for. There is normally someone else affected, whether it's in the same country, whether it's in another country. You have some wonderful groups across country where parents share just simple things that can help. This seems to help, this treatment seems to help, this side effect. It makes a massive difference. And the one thing I would urge everybody in the audience to do, if you have time, is go onto YouTube, search for a video about Kay Parkinson and the story about Kay. And she had two children, and they're both dead. They both had Ulstrom syndrome. There's still no effective treatment for Ulstrom syndrome. But if there had been a diagnosis earlier, they wouldn't have suffered in the way they suffered, and they would have been able to control the side effects a lot more successfully than they did, that ultimately led to their death. So there's a massive, massive need for people to work in rare disease. And I hope that part of this has given people the incentive to look at it and hopefully take up the baton.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Neil. And thank you very much, Tiina. And thank you very much, Manos. Well, so some extraordinary discussion this afternoon. Thank you very much indeed for your contribution, your wise words, and your personal experience as well. It was really, really interesting. I was also inspired. I may change careers quite soon too, but I really, really great thoughts. Really super questions from the audience. Thank you very much indeed. I just would like to end by saying it's going to be critical that the kind of next generation of researchers, entrepreneurs, economists, public health, policy, qualitative researchers all get involved. Engineers, chemists, all of us working together to address these unmet needs, pooling ideas, being flexible about moving across disciplines and diseases to maximize the impact. And it's truly rewarding if a difference can be made. And I think we've also been hearing this afternoon about how we can learn across some of these different unmet needs. How can we address, drug-resistant infections, learning from the skills of people who are working in the rare disease space and vice versa. So I think there was some really interesting discussion there. Thank you very much indeed for allowing me to chair this panel of amazing global experts. It's been a complete pleasure. And I am going to wind up now, but I'm really delighted that Tiina, Neil, and Manos are going to be able to join the networking group afterwards. Unfortunately, I won't be able to, but you've got the A team here who are going to. So thank you all very much, and over to Sally. Sally.
Thanks so much, Alison and Tiina, Neil, Manos, for your discussion today. I think all the things you discussed were so important, so pertinent, and so overlooked. So thank you so much for shedding light on why it's so important and sharing your experiences and your career stories and everything that you've experienced in these fields. And thanks also, Alison, for summarizing and encouraging our leaders of tomorrow to enter these unmet need fields. And thanks once again